Welcome to a brand new episode of Seize the Moment podcast. And today we have a very special guest. Today we have on Marianne Lewis. She's a dean of the University of Cincinnati's Lindner School of Business and a professor of management. She formerly served as dean at Cass Business School in London, and her work has appeared in major outlets such as the New York Times, CNBC, Financial Times, and the Harvard Business Review. And her new book, co-authored with Wendy Smith, is called Both and Thinking, Embracing Creative Tensions to Solve Your Toughest Problems. Welcome, Marianne. Thank you for coming on.
Oh, thank you, Alan. Thank you, Leon. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Absolutely. And so to quote from Marianne and Wendy's book, they write, in the research that we conducted over the past 25 years, the two of us noticed significant differences in how people understand and respond to their toughest problems. Our own quest has explored corporate behemoths such as IBM and Lego, startups and social enterprises, as well as nonprofits and government agencies. This research has taken us to places like Greece, Cambodia, and an island as at one of the four corners of the flat world. We've learned from all kinds of leaders as they grapple with some of the most difficult organizational challenges. We have also studied people struggling with personal concerns, from mundane issues to life-changing decisions. Regardless of context, such messy problems are difficult because they present us with dilemmas, choices between alternatives. Do I stick with the comfort of my current career path or make a bold jump to a new opportunity? Do I do what's best for my company overall or what's best for individual employees? Do I spend my time focusing on my own needs or put those needs aside to be there for others? We feel tension, the experience of opposition. It feels like an ongoing tug of war, and it begs for a response. So I love that, and I love that it focuses. A lot of this work applies to so many different areas. I mean, as you know, we said before we started filming in terms of therapy and how kind of I conceptualize it, but also I love that we can apply this to broader structures, and we can apply this to organizational thinking. So before we get into the different applications and obviously kind of how some of these ideas pop up in particular instances, especially in our specific lives, can we talk about, first of all, what is either or thinking, and why do we tend to get stuck in it?
Either or thinking is really our default. It's a very rational, logical approach. It's a very human tendency when we face something that feels like, I've got a job opportunity. Do I stay or do I go? Right, is one that we think about a lot. We weigh the pros and cons of both. We put them literally on a scale and we make a choice. And that's an either or. The problem with an either or is that it limits us immediately. I mean, are we really stuck with those two choices? What else might be there to consider? But furthermore, the more we apply an either or approach, the more we tend to lean toward a favorite side. So whichever side it is, let's focus on ourselves or others. We tend to reinforce that approach over time until it's really a strength has become a weakness and we've missed the other side that we also need. So we see this either or everywhere, but it is something that we are really in many ways trained to do from early childhood. It feels like we've got a sense of control when we can weigh a pro and con and make a choice, but it's really a faulty sense of control because a lot of these choices will come back. We'll have to make it again, self and other, today and tomorrow. Right? Efficiency, innovation, you name the tension. More often than not, every choice is part of an ongoing journey in that tension.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, and I could totally relate to how it could be limiting. I mean, just to give a sort of a quick example, if I had to apply this, let's say, to a relationship, say I've had the choice, okay, stay in this relationship because this offers me incredible value and we both get something out of it, and or maybe leave the relationship because things have been unpleasant, and and then there's sort of this tension between the two choices. But what's interesting is I'm only thinking about two different options, right? I mean, what if I thought about I mean, of course, I can think about those two things, but what if I integrated my thought process? What if I thought maybe there's a way I can resolve the issue I'm having with that person, right? While recognizing that there's an issue. That I don't necessarily have to think, oh, there's only two ways out of this situation, right? And
And, and then speaking of resolution, it's interesting, and I love that you mentioned this because psychologically speaking, I tend to do this. So when I'm presented with several options, for me, so some people get stuck in that, right? Sort of like getting stuck in the
Hmm.
mud, where you're thinking, oh, well,
Right.
I don't know what to do, so I'm just going to kind of put off even making a decision. I actually do the alternative. What I do is I just make a snap decision, and I'm like, great, I'm choosing option A over B, and I'm just rolling with it, and I'm never thinking about it again. So I love when you kind of get into the psychology of this. You talk about that. You talk
Hmm.
about how people, how they kind of avoid in different ways. So one of the ones is the obvious one where you're not making a decision, and that's the one that everybody could see as avoidance. But then the other one is kind of avoiding the anxiety and the tension and living with it. So Marianne, can you talk a little bit about that? Some of the strategies that we use in terms of either or thinking and how kind of it helps us manage our emotions.
Well, and Alan, I love the example you were just using of a relationship, because I mean, relationships are certainly not black and white, right?
Yeah.
They're always nuanced and complicated. Now, I'm not saying sometimes we have to make a choice, right? We may get to a point, it's abusive, it's unhealthy, whatever the case, to make a choice. But to your point, Leon, right? On the one hand, these tensions, I find that they're a double-edged sword, right? In many ways, they can be paralyzing and destructive, right, on the negative side, but they can also spur change and learning that's really important and powerful, right? That feeling you get with an anxiety, with tension. I mean, even when I say the word, I can feel it in my chest.
Mhm.
And as soon as you feel it, to me, that's a trigger. And the question is, can we use that trigger to question why? Why are we having that emotion? What's going on? Can we dig a bit deeper? Can we build a more holistic understanding of what's going on? Look at it from multiple angles and work through it, right? Accept it and work through it. Or we could do what you were just saying, Leon. One, we can just avoid it, put our head in the sand and hope it goes away. Or we could make a really quick decision. And here's where I would say a quick decision can work. And maybe this is what you meant by that too, is you make a quick decision and you see if it works, if it, and you kind of just keep, we call that tightrope walking, right? You
Mhm.
make a decision and you look around and say, did it work? Maybe we make another one, we add to it. But to your point, Ellen, the other question could be, well, but how could we improve the relationship, right? It's not
Mhm.
stay or go. It could be change, right?
Right. Yeah.
In a host of different ways.
Oh, so yeah, can we talk about that? So, especially in terms
Mhm.
of relationships, I like that we've kind of gone down this
I
road,
like
right?
that.
Sure.
So, yeah, right, because the relationship is actually the kind of simplest idea. Oftentimes, we think, okay, do I just accept the person as they are, or do I just kind of walk away and do my own thing, right? So, Alan, I'm actually now going to go to you since since you already mentioned it.
Sure.
Okay, so if you had to start thinking about how to resolve a relationship, like any whatever particular struggle that you're having, like what could that third option be? Because that's one I think people get stuck in.
For me, I'm the type of person that likes to, here's the thing. For me, I like to explore every single possible perspective, option, try to also think about, have some sort of empathy, think about from their
Mhm.
perspective, like what's their experience of me, not
Mhm.
to become sort of selfish and sort of absorbed by my own perspective on the situation. I try to explore having a conversation with them, letting them know what my feelings are, and then because a lot of times in relationships, I notice that a lot of times you carry this expectation that the other person knows what it is that you're thinking or feeling. You almost have this
Mhm.
thing like, oh, they can read my mind, and if they don't do this thing I'm expecting of them to do, then because they're violating that expectation, minus points for them, or that's it. But sometimes letting them know, oh, this is actually how you made me feel in this particular situation, or this is just how I feel in general. They're like, oh wow, like here's the thing, every person's going to be different in a relationship. Not everyone is going to be incredibly nice, not everyone is a perfect human being, but there is a chance that through communication, by letting them know how it is that you feel, they might actually be surprised and then be
Mhm.
like, oh, you've been feeling this way the whole time. That's not at all how I wanted you to perceive me. No, this is what I was thinking. Oh, this is what I meant. Oh, this is why I did this. And then all of a sudden that allows for more conversation to take place, and um, maybe resolving whatever the issues are. Now I know that these are a lot of maybes and hypotheticals, uh,
Mhm.
but I mean, a lot of relationships that I've had that haven't succeeded. it's through lack of communication or misunderstanding. And
Mhm.
sometimes when you actually have these conversations and you explore different options, different perspectives, and you try to embrace the tension and discomfort that occurs, as opposed to trying to avoid it or leave the situation, you might be pleasantly surprised, and the other person might be pleasantly surprised, and that could lead to some sort of resolution. Yeah.
Well, and I would note on that. I mean, some of the things that I've read that Leon's written about CBT. I mean, there's also the perception versus reality, and are you over assuming what's going on in the other person's mind?
Right.
Right? How did you juxtapose your expectations and your beliefs versus diving into what are they really feeling? What do they really mean by what they're doing? I'll go a different, maybe off the beaten path place. So Wendy and I, in our book and in our research, often turn to paradox. And so these tensions that feel like contradictions, when they're also interdependent, right? I mean, some of what we're talking about is, do we focus on ourself or other? And you need both. Now, the question is, how do you think yin yang? How do you enable both at the same time? Well, one way that you can think about alternatives is you can play with notions of time and space.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I'm getting really philosophical, but I mean, Einstein and Niels Bohr and others did this even with, how do they leverage paradoxes when they were studying quantum physics. But in the case of relationships, it might open up a whole host of areas. Think about time. Do you take some separation? Do you take a vacation together? I mean, right, how do you compartmentalize what you're doing in the relationship to either be closer and or farther apart to figure out what's going on? But you could do the same thing with space. I mean, I lived overseas for a while, right? Within a relationship that you could say, look, let's use that space positively when we're apart, and then even more powerfully when they're together. My point being, I think it's more than just, are we together?
Right.
Yeah.
I love the concept of paradox being paradoxical too. So before we even move into both and thinking, I love that. So, kind of as you're reading the book, you're thinking, oh, okay, great. So, both and thinking is good. And then either or thinking is bad, which is obviously very black and white. So
Right.
you guys actually argue that that's not the case, right? So either or thinking is applicable in some cases. And you mentioned the notion, like you just said before, of tightrope walking, right? So can you tell us a little bit about that and why either or thinking can sometimes apply and actually be the more beneficial version of thinking or, making decisions?
Well, when we think about either or thinking, it's efficient.
Yeah.
It's clear, right? It's about making a choice. It's also limited. So the point with tightrope walking, we talk about one of the benefits of both and thinking is actually making either or choices over time, but realizing there are more choices. It's not a one-off. So, I mean, I'll go away from, say, an interpersonal, and because we work a lot with organizations, and so an issue that we hear all the time from businesses is, do we focus on our current product or do we move into some bold innovation? We do this in our lives. Do I focus on my current target or do I learn and explore? Right? Same question. Well, we might need to make a decision today. That could be an either or decision. Let's weigh the pros and cons about what our resources, right? What our issues need at this moment. But with an understanding, we're going to have to make that again, right? We may decide right now, we got to hit our targets. We got to make sure we got the profit. We're about to, have financial statements come out or annual reviews, right? I'm doing organizational, individual. And so today we're going to hit the targets, right? We're going to focus on the core. But tomorrow we might have a little more, slack. We may be looking around and saying our competitors are really moving fast or technology has changed. And so tomorrow we may say we're going to need to explore and work on some bold innovation. That's this tightrope walking. Yes, I am making decisions that are either or in the moment, but is with this broader horizon. I'm walking on the tightrope. I'm literally looking forward and I'm making these micro decisions over time. And a challenge we hear from leaders in particular is, but then I feel inconsistent. Are people going to think I'm waffling? Well, I think we do this in our own lives. Back to your question of why do we either or so much? We want to feel consistent. But you can feel consistent by saying it is both. We are going to have to do both over time. Today we're doing X. We've had leaders we work with who will start a meeting reminding people we need both sides of this coin. And today, based on what we're seeing, we're going to put more emphasis on the today, or
Right.
right, either way. But the point being, they're demonstrating I am tightrope walking, which is a cool way of saying I'm making an either or in a both and world.
Right.
And it's going to be both over time.
Right. And I love that you're saying when you're tightrope walking, you're essentially not going to either extreme. I mean, the idea is the balancing
Yes,
act. Yeah. The example
right.
that you use. Yeah. And the example that you use is even when we're walking, we're essentially balancing, even though we don't kind of sense it. And we feel like, okay, I'm just going from point A to point B, but we're constantly slightly shifting ourselves. That we, again, imperceptible, but we're constantly shifting ourselves. So what's so interesting about that is that, you know, psychologically speaking, when I talk to my clients about this, oftentimes they struggle with what authenticity means. And if they're doing something that's counter to their character, you know, whatever that is, you know, does that mean that they're being disingenuous? Because one of the things that people hate being is fake. And they hate other people perceiving them as being fake. So what's interesting, and again, going back to the concept of both and, is that we are a hodgepodge of traits, and those traits pop up in different situations. So it's so interesting to me that people love to kind of and I get it, there's a safety involved, but they love to conceptualize themselves as being something either than something else. So it's like, you know, I'm a risk taker, or I'm somebody who's preoccupied with safety, or let's say, you know, I'm somebody who's super courageous, or I'm a coward, right? And it's so interesting how these concepts define people. Yet if you're thinking about those moments, it realistically, if you're looking at the objective span of that person's life, you can probably find many moments where you were the opposite thing, and that's okay.
Yeah, and actually there's so many different angles we can take, but just on that note, I mean, even somebody's conception of authenticity is interesting, right? I mean, if they themselves define it as, oh, anytime I'm acting counter to this trait I'm used to having, like, oh, I'm usually not courageous, therefore if I act courageously, oh, I'm acting outside of my usual, you know, personality, and therefore I'm not being authentic, right? But then on another level, it's like, well, how do you know that that personality trait that's actually authenticity? That's the real you. That could be a false conception, and then you taking an action that's outside of your usual traits might actually help to sort of expand your identity, and therefore you might think about it wrong. Just because it feels uncomfortable doesn't mean it's not authentic. It could be something that's beneficial in the long run.
Right. I love that. And now to kind of get and now to get into both and thinking, right now is kind of a in the conversation. So what happens now? So when a person says, well, you know, it's really hard for me to sort of see the kind of paradox, or to live with it, or to live with the tension. Now, how do we kind of start exploring this? And what do we tell people about sort of how cognition works, and essentially how life works, right? How fundamentally there are these underlying paradoxes that whether or not you avoid them, they're going to be there.
Well, Wendy and I always say we start by changing the question, because the questions we ask ourselves or others immediately limit our options. Right. So if you think about a classic either or dilemma, we often say, do I stay or go? Right. Do I do X or B to be authentic? Do I, right, focus on today or tomorrow? But as soon as you've said that, you've limited yourself to two, and you've made yourself have to weigh these pros and cons. I mean, while it sounds like a simple change of words, we think this is, you know, it is classical CBT. It is reframing. How do we frame to ask ourselves, how might we accommodate A and B, right? How might we reframe authenticity? I love what you guys were just saying, right? Authenticity, if we framed it, as we sometimes hear people say, means singularity. That's not what authenticity means. Authenticity means our whole selves, and our whole selves are complicated, and nuanced and contradictory, and that's all okay, right? But we always say the first piece of both and thinking is to reframe the question, and just actually question our question and ask ourselves, why are we even framing it this way? Because we've limited our possibilities and ourselves in that process. So that's the first piece to us and to us, that's both cognitive, but it's also emotional. Because one of the reasons we don't reframe is that our emotions get in the way, right? We get anxious, we get fearful, right? It's that classic challenge of, say, being bold and risk-taking, but ambitious, right? Brene Brown's needing vulnerability. It's two sides of the same coin. Yes, it is. Right?
Yeah, and then thinking about sort of thinking about both and thinking in the now since I know we brought up the kind of CBT component, it's so interesting to me that when I kind of focus on CBT, and a lot of times it's sort of taught this way, which I don't necessarily agree with, where the idea is that you have kind of your rational component and then you have the emotional side, and essentially and fundamentally the purpose of CBT is to use that rational component to kind of manage or in some way subdue kind of the emotional part of you, which is I would say a bastardization of what CBT is supposed to be, but oftentimes it really is taught that way. And most people think of it that way. So I mentioned this, before we started the show, that when we had Massimo Pigliucci on, he talked a little bit about this, not just in terms of CBT, but in terms of Stoic thinking. And he said that, a lot of times when people think of Stoicism, they think, again, another bastardization, they think about Stoics kind of using their reason to quell their emotions, where it's like, I am purely rational, like Spock, right? I don't have any emotions. Like this other part of me doesn't necessarily exist. It's the denial of it. And so he argued that, no, it's a kind of harmony that you're supposed to cultivate. Your emotions and your reason are supposed to live together and in a way work for each other. And I found a lot of what you said in terms of both and thinking to be applicable to CBT and just kind of emotional affect regulation, because what we're saying fundamentally is that both sides, right, just like the yin and yang, both sides in some ways have a little bit of a kernel of the other, right? So when we're thinking about the rational component, I mean, so just to kind of try to conceptualize this, it's really the emotions that lead us to think, right? So it's like, let's say, I don't know, I sense danger somewhere, right? And let's say, I don't know, I'm sitting next to Alan and I get really anxious. Now, all of a sudden I start to think, right? I'm like, oh, why am I anxious? What's the data telling me, right? So the evidence says this, the evidence against my belief says that. But essentially what I'm doing is I'm using that as that anxiety as a starting point for rational thinking. And then at the other end of it, when we're thinking about the component of the emotional and the rational, we're essentially saying to ourselves, okay, what is it about the rational that we're trying to do? Like, why are we using it? Oh, right, because we're using it to manage the emotion, the stuff that's kind of springing up, that's making us feel, kind of crappy and really negative, and it's not necessarily something we want to have. We want to kind of try to feel better, we want to mitigate our suffering, whatever, right? So it's like it works in this perfect harmony, and I love that essentially that's what you say, and using the concept of the yin and yang, that you can't, these paradoxes are all interdependent. You can't really have, again, reason over here, emotion over here, and in some ways or another kind of they work in a master kind of slave dichotomy, where yes, the reason is always the sort of the tyrant and the master, and the emotions have to kind of learn their place. And I love that you're saying essentially, no, it's not like that.
Well, I am saying that, and I would add, there's actually three kind of components to paradox that you're playing with there that I think it's worth calling out, because we, especially in more the West versus say the Far East, I mean, we look a lot to Tai Chi and other areas when we think about paradox, but it's about contradictions that are interdependent and that are persistent, meaning they don't go away. Right. So what, I go to like self and other, innovation and efficiency, love and hate. I mean, these don't go away. And they're actually two sides of the same coin, which that interdependence fosters the persistence. But when you can come to a place of acceptance that they're not going to go away, really our push is to say, then let's get ourselves out of, even words like harmony and balance make me nervous, because I think it's harmonizing and balancing. And I know I'm just maybe playing word games, but I think we put so much on ourselves that we think there's this static place we can get to, and it's not. It's a journey. And that, I think, gives us some hope and empowerment to move forward on the tightrope.
Right. So what I hear you saying is that it's kind of absurd to think that you're always going to be harmonizing, right? So the idea is that, yes, going back to tightrope walking, is that sometimes you're going to have to fluctuate between contradictions. And, again, thinking about this in terms of therapy. So this is actually something that comes up a lot in my sessions, where sometimes patients, so I want to kind of try to sum this up. So we have something called the cognitive thought record. And all it just means is it's a way for you to reframe your thoughts in a pretty manualized and structured way. So there's kind of a system, you go through it, and then you're like, oh, okay, this is what the kind of rational or realistic thought is, right? So not to get into that too much, but what I'm saying is that a lot of times patients will say something along the lines of like, well, I'm just too anxious to do the thought record. I just feel, let's say, too upset or too angry or too scared to think critically. It doesn't work that way, right? So, and then I beat myself up because I'm thinking like, oh my God, harmony is the result. Like I need to do this to maintain or return to equilibrium. And so my thinking is that, no, man, sometimes what's going to happen is the stresses are going to be so kind of compounded. And so kind of severe or significant, that, yeah, it's going to be pretty hard for you to critically think. So even though
Mhm.
the thought record is kind of a tool that we use, and yes, in the long run, if we're looking at, kind of the space of your treatment, yes, the thought record is going to help you kind of manage your emotions and feel better in the long run. But we're saying that if we're plotting it, let's say it's a chart of some sort, and we're plotting, across we're plotting a line in terms of how you feel, we're seeing on average you're feeling better. But yes, in every single moment, you don't have to use the thought record. So what that means is that sometimes you're going to have overwhelming emotions. Honestly, sometimes you're not really going to feel much of anything. So, and that's just what it is to live as a contradictory person. That sometimes it's going to work, sometimes it's not. Sometimes you're going to want to use it, sometimes you're not going to want to use it. Sometimes you're going to be able to use it, sometimes you're not.
Yeah, and also on that note, I mean, this sort of relates to both and thinking. I think even, but this is no knock on CBT. I think CBT is beautiful. It's just that there could be other approaches as well to sort of
Mhm.
dealing with your thoughts or your emotions, right? I mean, for example, one might argue that the resistance to the emotions that you might be feeling might actually cause you to rationalize and think all these different thoughts, these thousands of different thoughts. And yes, using CBT to organize and sort of rationalize why this thought makes sense and that thought doesn't make sense in order to resolve that emotional tension is beautiful. It's great. It's just that you could argue that maybe actually not necessarily resisting the emotion and feeling the emotion completely to its hilt might actually at the root stop you from necessarily thinking and rationalizing all these different thoughts. And so there might be different approaches how to deal with this. But so I don't know if that's sort of.
No, I love that. Yep. And by the way, I would even argue like great CBT, and again, this is sort of more ideal. What you find is the kind of harmony between the two, right? So, I mean, I'm going to just give a kind of a simple conception. So let's say on the one hand, your anxiety says to you, like, I'm in danger, right? And then on the other hand, the reframe thought, let's say, might say something like, or at least your perspective, you're kind of forward thinking in terms of what you think the reframe thought is going to be, let's say, I'm safe, right? Technically, both of those things aren't necessarily true, right? These are two extremes. So what a lot of times my clients think about is that when they say, what they're like, I'm doing the thought record, I'm thinking I'm supposed to go to some other extreme. And I tell them no, because essentially there's some kernel of truth in what your emotions are telling you. So if you have anxiety, I mean, yes, it might be overblown to whatever extent. I mean, it's kind of hard to quantify, but the anxiety is there for a reason. I mean, there's a reason why you're scared. There's risk involved in everything that you do. So when we're thinking about, again, both and conceptualizing in that way, technically neither side is actually right. So remember, there's a kernel of truth in everything. That's that yin and yang. Yeah.
Well, and maybe I'll suggest another technique, and this is moving away from kind of the psychotherapy techniques, but we call it a polarity map. And we say, the first step is you change the question, but the second is that you separate and connect. So when we're doing kind of the either or approach, we separate and analyze, right? We're just going to make a choice from it. But using both and we typically think about Barry Johnson. Don't know if you've ever read any of Barry Johnson's work on polarity management. But as you weigh the pros and cons of both sides, we call that separating, really diving in, because what we want people to be able to see, and we do this with individuals, with teams, with C-suite leaders, what you can see better when these are paradoxical tensions is that the cons of one side are the pros of another and vice versa. And when you start to see that, you realize, one, you need both because you want the pros of both sides.
Right.
But it also helps you dive into the cons and realize, and I can't remember which one of you guys said this, is how do you avoid leaning too far to one side?
Right.
How do you know if you make a decision on right and you're looking at these two sides and you start to go to an extreme, you'll see yourself starting to hit the negatives, the cons. Oftentimes when we have that happen, we swing the pendulum to the opposite. And sometimes we can swing too hard. We can actually overcorrect and very quickly go from the pros of the other side to their cons. And what you see is the shape that feels like an infinity loop. So this polarity map we often use with individuals and teams, one, to help them realize we've all been there. We've all been in a vicious cycle where we play so hard on one strength that it becomes a weakness. We swing over. You see my kind of signals. But the more that we can understand those dynamics, we've seen them before, the better off we can be sensitizing ourselves to when they start to happen again.
Right.
When do we need to take the next step? How do we need to move forward? So the separation actually helps us connect. Because we start to realize, boy, we really do need both of these sides. I need to take good self-care and self-reliance, and I need intimacy and love. right? You kind of have just
Hmm.
pulled out, a self versus other. So how do we make sure we're doing both sides of those, and how do we connect them in a way that maybe through the nature of our relationships, the nature of our use of time and space, that we have time for both myself and my partner, right? I mean, we can play a number of different ways there, but a polarity map helps dissect both opposing sides and their interconnections. And we find that really helpful just to work through and get away from and sometimes what we'll do, especially if we have like a polarized group, have the opposite side do the pros and cons of the other.
Mm.
Because as they do it, they'll kind of realize, oh yeah, there are some pros. Like, no, you have to defend the pros of the other. And you'll find it opens us.
Yeah, that reminds me of when we had Kirk Schneider on the show. We talked about his book. We're gonna have him on again actually next week, but he had a book, Depolarizing America, and that's exactly what he did. Yeah, he would have these groups, and they would actually outline what are the pros and cons of each side, have them meet and talk with each other, and
I have Kirk's book right up. His book, The Paradoxical Self, I think is brilliant. Just
yeah,
brilliant.
no,
I'm
no,
going to
he's
have to
awesome.
find.
Yeah.
Oh, he's fascinating, because I love the way he approaches psychology as necessarily contradictory and paradoxical. I mean, the way he uses Kierkegaard, I think, is brilliant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I didn't
And
realize you had him on. That's wonderful. He
Oh
was one
yeah.
of my. I'm in management, so I went early into the rabbit holes of psychology and sociology and anthropology and philosophy and then mysticism. And then I thought, where have I gone? But it was people like Kirk that made me realize we're actually seeing the same patterns. We're seeing these paradoxical patterns in the individual, in groups, in organizations, in society. And my real hope is to help people, and I know he and others are doing the same, you as well, to get more comfortable with the discomfort of those tensions, because they're natural.
Yeah.
And learn how to work through them.
100%. And what's interesting, this happened to me in my sort of early 20s, but it's when I was listening to Alan Watts. He brought he made Eastern philosophy a little more popular in the West, essentially.
Yes.
And there's this one thing that he said that always stuck with me. I usually have trouble remembering a lot of things that I've read or learned, but this thing I didn't forget. It's that every explicit duality has an implicit unity. So, for example, yes and no, explicitly they're different, but why they're united is one relies on the other for its existence. Light and dark, love and hate.
They define each other.
And what was interesting to me about that is then it even like hearing that made me very interested in thinking about, like, if I ever took a side, why does the other side believe whatever it is that they believe, right? And then I try to look at what they're thinking and then what I'm thinking, and then sort of integrate that and try to sort as best as I possibly can. You're always going to have some kind of blind spot, but as best as possible, try to look at everything from sort of a zoomed out perspective in order to find either truth or try to approach things the best possible way that works for everyone.
Right. Because I think what you're saying is there's a kernel of truth essentially in each side. I mean, you might support one more so than the other, but there's something about another side that makes you go, oh, okay. I mean, I can see why they would think that.
Plus, I mean, if we're thinking in terms of, I mean, this is I'm not trying to get into this too much, but if you think in terms of who is right and who is wrong, if you think about politics or something like that, I mean, if somebody believes so vehemently whatever it is that they believe, everybody thinks they're good. Everyone thinks that they're on the side of right or on the side of God or whatever. I mean, or they think they're the hero.
Yeah.
I find that very interesting because I would think that too, right? And they think it, but for some reason they're thinking whatever it is they're thinking, and I'm thinking whatever it is I'm thinking, and I find that weird, and I don't want us. Why are we fighting then? We both believe we're good, right? Or we both believe we're in the right.
We want what's best. We want what's best for the world, right?
Sure. So then I try to look at that and then see, you know, what's going on here.
Now, okay, perfect, right? So, because now, Marianne, now we're talking about overarching values. This was actually my favorite part of the book. I love that you brought that up, right? So, yeah, there we go, right? So, when we're talking about like conflicting kind of thoughts or conflicting positions, right? What you're talking about, or what you guys get into, is now again overarching values. Kind of how can we unite them based on shared goals, shared values, shared visions, etc. Right? So, can you talk about that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you know, we see a lot of vicious cycles and the opportunity for virtuous. So, I mean, we talked briefly about two vicious cycles, and I think you're getting at the third, because we see three. One is we call entrenchment, which is the rabbit hole, going down one side so deeply that it's all you see and until you hit rock bottom. The second is that overcorrection. We call that the wrecking ball, right? Because you swing so hard, you actually destroy the good that you've done in the meantime. And then the third is polarization, which we think of as trench warfare. And what we're really talking about is different individuals, different groups in different rabbit holes, right? Shooting at each other, becoming increasingly polarized, insular, dehumanizing the other, right? Actually pulling it apart. Because I couldn't agree more, Alan. I mean, 9 times out of 10, and Wendy and I just really love going into political issues ourselves, because we both lean just slightly to other places, and we can talk so much because it breaks your heart, because you realize, wow, we really do want the same thing. The issue is we see how we get there differently. Well, that's okay, because there are lots of ways to get there. There is no straight line, right? These are really intricate. And I think you might be talking about, Leon, in the book, there we'd use a number of examples, but it was fascinating for me to be in London during the Brexit vote. And, you know, being an outsider, and I'm the dean of a business school. I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I cannot be ignorant. I have got to try to understand what's going on. Talk to lots and lots of different people. And the more I learned, the more complicated it became, right? And then you'd watch the news and hear these statements that were so simplistic. I mean, to like a ridiculous amount. Now you can imagine what happened in the US like shortly thereafter, but I'm watching it just thinking, what is going on? And I'm walking with Jose Manuel Barroso. He was the former president of the EU. And I'm walking with 2 members after Jose has just given a talk. And it was fabulous. It was just so interesting to hear him talk about the complexities. And I have 2 board members on my board. Both are on opposing side. One is a Remainer and one is a Leaver. Okay. And I'd gone to both of them to educate me, help me understand what's going on in this incredible. And I knew that they were on opposite sides as we're walking with Jose. And the one of the gentlemen said, those people who voted to leave are ignorant, racist, bigot, uneducated. I mean, he just went through this thing, and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I'm going to have a fist fight. I'm going to have a fist fight, right? But it was this incredible, isolated, dehumanized, right? And I watched Jose Manuel Barroso, and you realized, oh, this is why he was president of the EU, just with a big smile. And he didn't know what the other fellow, as I'm watching like the other guy's body language he said, you know what's amazing about this is that the complexities are enormous. Let's dive a bit further around this. And we sat down for coffee, and both gentlemen by the end were smiling. They're talking about what different reasons that they see needing the value of staying and leaving. But actually, it left the conversation completely left whether we stay or leave. It was really about the values of centralization versus decentralization, and where you might need one more of one than the other. And it was, now I realize this is the challenge of politics. At some point, you have to vote.
Right.
Yeah.
Right? We weren't having a discussion about voting. But I watched Manuel Barroso basically show how you would manage a negotiation in a committee by getting everything these 2 gentlemen felt onto the table and play with the nuances and keep asking questions. And I left that always thinking, how do I avoid the defensiveness and ask better questions when we have these complicated issues? And it is so hard to do in this world right now. We're so isolated. And I can't stand the dehumanizing negativity across. But I also think people actually want what's best. We just see different paths.
Right. And I think that's what's so important about shared values, because a lot of times what happens is I think people have different conceptions of what the other side is thinking or what they
I
want, just like our
agreed.
side, right? Right, right. So it's sort of like, the other side, like they want to ruin our country, or,
Right.
they want to sort of, let's say, I don't know, deport all of the minorities or whatever the kind of conceptions are. So what's interesting about that is that, I mean, that's true to some extent. I mean, there are definitely subsections of people who do want that and do think that. But for the most part, and we had Nate Gowdy on last week, and this was a really interesting conversation. Yeah, he was actually at the insurrection. So he's a photographer for Rolling Stone and photographed it. And so we talked about the different types of people he met there. And he said, he's like, a lot of them were really helpful to me, or some of them at least were really helpful to me. And he said, there was a moment where he was pushed, and there was another moment when he was attacked. And then there were other people at the kind of the protests, whatever you want to kind of call it, insurrection. And he said they were helpful to me, though they helped me up. They kind of tried to talk me through it, etc. So what that says is that, even though there are people that we're going to disagree with, and they're definitely going to be extremists I hate saying this because it's sort of overused, but yes, on either side, even though I would argue that on the left, the extremists are like Antifa is nowhere near as bad as what it is on the right. But whatever, to put that aside. But what I'm saying is that you're always going to have people, and I would say the vast majority of people, who are way more central than that, and who, even though they believe in different things, they essentially do have the same goal as you. And so I love that we can kind of sit at the table, even though maybe this is a little bit too idealistic, but as you're saying, it's obviously not. And obviously there are other examples that show that it's not, that we can actually get people together and ask ourselves, like, what's best for all of us? Like, we want the same things. We want our children to grow up in a country that's
Right.
sort of viable for all of us.
Yeah. I think something that you mentioned that Manuel did in terms of structuring
Mm-hmm.
a way that those two members of the
Mm-hmm.
board could converse with each other. I think it's just about and it's something you talk about in the book too. It is about framing, right? I mean, so if, for example,
Mm-hmm. It is.
individually, yeah, if I were conversing with somebody, and let's say they did say some sort of a surface level comment to me, like for example, oh, they're racist, they're this and they're that. So I have a choice at that moment. Say they're on the opposite side of whatever. It doesn't have to be a political spec. It could just be whatever argument. It doesn't matter. But say they say something like that. I, at that point, can choose to react and also come at them surface level, or I might not like their tone. I might,
Right.
who knows? You could get into it, and then you get into sort of a downward spiral of, there's no more communication that can be held, especially since there's sort of a break in rapport. And now you're not even just because you don't like that person, now you're not going to listen to what they have to say and
Right now it's
rationalize.
focused on the person, not on the issue, right?
Yeah.
Not on the ultimate desire either.
Yeah. So then choosing to ask, keep calm, not necessarily react. Maybe ask questions
Keep
like,
calm
"Oh,
and
so
carry on."
essentially, yeah." And maybe ask, "Oh, so, but like, why do you feel that way, or what do you think about X, Y, Z?" And then try to get them to now get into sort of a longer form conversation with you, where then and then listen to what they have to say. Like, I mean, this is really old. I mean, it depends where you want to grab it. Different people have made this saying very famous, but seeking first to understand, then to be understood. So if you actually completely listen to whatever it is that person was saying, even if they began with a surface level thought that could be a little bit could sort of engage you in the wrong way, then they'll feel like, oh, from your listening, oh, this person respects what it is that I'm saying. And then there's a little increase in rapport there. Then, because you fully listened to what they said, you might ask them, okay, so would you like to hear my thought on what it is that you said? It's respectful. Not everyone's going to have this level of communication with you, because this is a complicated sort of a dance. But if you can successfully sort of navigate it, you actually could then get into a longer form conversation, and then have that conversation, and then actually get to know each other's values, and maybe potentially meet somewhere in the middle. So Manuel sounds awesome as far as that
Well,
goes.
and I love what you're saying. I mean, really, it's been interesting just since writing the book, because Wendy and I have never studied politics. I mean, we've always studied organizations, individuals, and groups. I mean, and typically in business, but so much has come at us from the political polarization side. One of the reasons I share that is it's become fascinating to me. So the book came out in August, and since then I've read, The Righteous Mind, Jonathan Haidt, and Arthur Brooks' Love Your Enemy, and Ezra Klein's Why We're Polarized, and then you read Adam Grant, right? Think Again. And they're basically all talking about the very vicious cycles that of polarization that are happening. And they use different lenses to explain why. And in my view, it's all, right? You said that, the righteous mind, right? There you get into the hero kind of view, right? The more we're on the right, but everybody feels that. And the more you feel that, the more it pulls. Or Arthur Brooks, right? It goes more at a culture of, what is his view? Kind of a deviance, right? And basically that we believe you want to sink us, which then basically makes the pulling even harder against each other. And I love Adam Grant's view of it, which is, but if we thought more like scientists rather than like politicians or proselytizers, right? We would be asking questions.
Right.
We would be asking to understand. Tell me more. Tell me why you think that way. Because one of the things that after reading Adam's book, and Wendy and I have talked about this a bit, and we know Adam a bit, is his view is, if you can get to the more personal side of those questions, this is where the ultimate kind of wow can happen. Someone is likely to say something like, well, you know what happened to me when I was young? And they can tell a story that suddenly you think, it makes you realize this is just a human who's had one set of experiences to filter these external events through. And there's a reason why they've leaned in a particular way. And then they tend to talk to others that think, and it reinforces over time. But by making it personal, not in a like name calling, but there's a reason, right? Wendy and I did this going down kind of the exploring, abortion issues. Geez, talk about some hot topics. But this isn't, do you want, the right to life, right to choose are so extreme that 90% of the people you talk with are in the middle. But they see different sides of like where you draw a line. And I realize that's incredibly complicated. But the stories of understanding why they are where they are really powerful because they're personal.
Yeah. And I mean, just to sort of bring this into the context, let's say of a corporation,
Yes.
let's say somebody suggests a new change, like, let's say, I don't know, I'll give a random example. It's a health insurance company. And at the board, they recommend, okay, so, we're used to using this particular customer relationship management tool. So an example of one, they call this a CRM application. Let's call it Salesforce, let's say. So, we're used to using Salesforce. We've been using Salesforce for years, right? And someone says, well, there's this actually brand new one. The user interface is incredible. The way if you use this, we're going to be more successful. They provide reason X, Y, Z, and then all the people on the board are like, well, we've been using this for years. Why? It's been successful for us. We don't need to do that. Our employees have been used to this. For them to even have learned how to use this tool, it took this much time. We don't need to shift to this new technology. I understand our competition has, and all of a sudden they've improved in this way, but here's this reason to justify why we should keep it and that. And so they might be resistant to change, right? But then maybe somebody comes into that conversation and then says, okay, so what are your exact issues with employing this new technology? And then maybe you'd hear them out. Maybe it's some of the reasons I highlighted here, right? And then maybe like, okay, well, I understand. Well, did you know that actually this is simpler, or you know what, this is actually more cost effective for us, or whatever. I know I'm being incredibly general here, but the thing is, like, I can imagine how people at a company would be used to doing things the old way, and then maybe somebody suggests something new, and then maybe the both and version of this would be like, okay, you know what? Let's try this new tool or this new application or this new thing you're suggesting, but how about we do it this way? Let's not introduce it just yet. We can do something called like a migration, or we'll migrate to this new tool. But first let's let everybody know in the company we're going to be switching to this new tool. And you know what? Let's give them a heads up. Let's say we're going to do this a year from now, 6 months from now, something like that. This way, already you're sort of engaging people and you're letting them know, okay, be ready for some kind of change. You don't want to put that on them right
And
away.
you know why I love this? Alan has literally cited an entire chapter in your book on experimentation. This is like it's like the entire chapter.
Well, yeah,
Yeah.
but essentially the idea is, there's a way to do something new and then still cater to someone
Yes.
who has that mindset of being used to the old. And I find that very interesting. Like there's a way to introduce new things, even though they're uncomfortable, and then still, sort of baby step towards this
Yep.
new innovation.
Yeah, and Marianne, as you're answering this, I would love to kind of, because I know we didn't focus on this and I really wanted to. Can you couch your answer into, or in the context of the examples of Lego and IBM and kind of how they dealt with experimentation and how they dealt with navigating between the new and the old?
Yeah, well, I mean, Lego is just one of my all-time favorite examples because they had such interesting vicious cycles twice, right? Was what we really analyze. But Alan, to your point about experimenting, I mean, what I love about experimenting, I would even expand it further, is the opportunity to improvise, right? Yeah. How can you experiment with boundaries, right? With some guidelines so that within those experiments, you can be building from the old or potentially connecting to the old, even as you build the new. But I like your example of say, a new technology, because if you say, do we stick with the old or go to the new? You've, again, completely limited yourself to those two. There may be a host of issues, but the first question I would ask is it really about Salesforce versus, pick the technology? Sure. What is it we're looking for? Is it about stability and leveraging more of what we already do? Or is it about, exploring the new, really moving boldly into new opportunities? I think typically we get that old new stability change a lot in organizations. And the change will 9 times out of 10 foster resistance. But if you can couch it with more of the old, right? If you can use the old to build some guardrails, some rules for improvisation, like, okay, the Salesforce actually has some really interesting capabilities that might let us connect with the new. Let's start to experiment with the new with an understanding that we're going to find ways to connect, even if eventually we may decide to completely replace the old with the new, right? But you can lower people's worries by saying, let's use some guardrails of the old as we experiment with the new. I mean, Lego did this considerably, right? They started to realize Lego wasn't a brick, and it wasn't just a brand, because that was everything. And then they went completely crazy. They made a better list of what do they think matters most as they develop new products. And by doing that, those guardrails actually fostered a whole lot of creativity in the company, but it wasn't blue sky, anything goes. It was creativity that could connect back to what they were best known for, best at, right? Really built on their legacies and their strengths. That's where I think, to your point, Leon, I mean, to me, Lego was really interesting, is while they almost took themselves down by swinging the pendulum so hard to radical innovation, I think it's incredibly impressive that they took a pause before they hit rock bottom and said, we need to learn from the strengths of radical innovation and what we've learned there, from the strengths of our control, shared family values, approach to quality, and pull them together. And now they continue to do these micro shifts between the two. And they're really good at it because they say, this is who we are now. We are the old who's always experimenting for the new. Right? I think their vision statement is, we inspiring the builders of tomorrow. I mean, which sounds maybe just like words, but it's cool because you can hear the builders, you can hear the brick, and the traditions of Lego, and you can also hear their values of always wanting to push the envelope. And so they found ways to do both. But I think that's what improvisation is. It's a paradoxical approach to experimentation. It's not anything goes.
Right. And then how did IBM falter?
No, say again?
Yeah, how did IBM falter? Because that's kind of the other extreme, right? So Lego was able to sustain itself, but IBM wasn't.
Well, and IBM's an interesting case because that's where Wendy started her research, was with IBM, when they were shifting from mainframes to cloud and new technologies. Now her early work, they actually were, some of the teams were making it work, but like a lot of firms, they missed opportunities to make the shift, to decide that the new was actually going to replace the old, right? Look at Blockbuster. They had the opportunity to buy Netflix.
Yeah.
I mean, talk about a hindsight being 2020, but Netflix is struggling now. I mean, every firm in the world goes through this challenge of old and new, right? The stability and leveraging what you have versus creating and destroying for the new. Every firm, I mean, that's the classic S curve that we see. So I don't think it's just IBM and Lego or Netflix or Polaroid. I mean, there's so many who never made it to the next S curve.
So yeah, and I love that you're picking up on that. That's exactly what I wanted to talk about next. So when we're talking about the S curve, right? So this is so interesting because I was thinking about this in the context of our podcast too. So a lot of times, and I'm sure you go through this as I do too, like when things are going well, we're like, oh, cool, let's just stay the course. Things are going really well. We're getting consistent viewership, etc. Right? So what I love is that when you're thinking about the S curve, you're essentially saying like, how do we kind of preclude that, right? How do we preclude that sort of downslope? So it's essentially it's an S curve juxtaposed on another S curve. And the idea is, yeah, and I love that, right? So the idea here is that before that downturn happens, like, first of all, how do we start to anticipate it? And how do we start to shift and kind of jump to another plateau as we're obviously, kind of heading downward? So the idea is like before this becomes a sinking ship, let's kind of try to innovate and pivot and get to a point where we have these new ideas and new kind of sort of maybe even ways of implementing different ideas that we've already had in order to preclude that from happening, which obviously didn't seem like IBM was able to do. So can we talk about the S curve? So essentially how it could work for us as opposed to obviously being detrimental?
Absolutely. And I mean, the S curve has been around for a while, but what I really love that you're saying, Leon, is increasingly, and I mean, many years ago, a guy by the name of Charles Handy, who's brilliant, wrote about the personal S curve, the second S curve in careers. Arthur Brooks just did it in Strength to Strength. S curves work in our personal lives too. Everything you just said that we think often about the big firms doing this, like in search of excellence type firms that have failed. It's our life, right? How do we start looking at what's next in our life? And like any S curve, you need to actually be doing it when you're at the high of where you are now. It's when you have the most energy, resources, slack. But it's also the time when you look around and go, well, why would I, don't fix it if it ain't broken type of thing. And so it's the classic place you don't start to look. More likely you wait until, man, I have lost my mojo. I just don't feel like I'm in the right place anymore. But at that point, your energy is down, your morale, your confidence, right? Potentially your financial resources, if you've even left the job. Now it's hard. Now it's really hard to start the next S curve. So you need actually multiple S curves working simultaneously. That's where we get into that paradoxical state. And it works at the individual level as well as the corporate and the team.
Yeah, an example that comes to mind is there's a rapper named Master P who started No Limit Records. And so he has a really brilliant business mind. The way he kind of said it and conceptualized it was he said, look, a lot of rappers, or just musicians and entertainment folks, right? It doesn't necessarily matter. He said they find it really hard to accept that you're probably going to be on top for about 3 to 5 years, right? 5 if you're lucky. And so he said essentially like it's, the flavor of the week. You're not going to reinvent yourself forever. And essentially, as you age, like the younger kids who buy albums, they're not going to care about you anymore. This is just life. So he says you have to kind of transition in that point when you're at a high. So within that 3 to 5 year period, he said, this is his thing. I mean, it doesn't necessarily has to be the only way. Obviously, it's not either or, but he says you have to start transitioning into products, man. He's like, you could sell food, you could kind of start, some sort of business on the side, whatever it is. And as you're taking that sort of notoriety that you have, or at least whatever fame, maybe not notoriety. So if you take some of that, pretty much whatever the fame, the recognition that you have, and then you, again, you're thinking about S curves and using one and kind of plateauing and then obviously going to the other. And so you're building your product because your name is already out there. People like you. Right. They already buy your records. They go to your music, or they go to your tours. They buy your music. And so he says, when you're thinking about products, right, you're thinking about the brand recognition. And then as you're obviously sort of fading away from the music industry, which is obviously inevitable, what's going to happen is people have already been buying your stuff. And as they've been buying your stuff and you're producing new products, different types of products, you're already kind of like Campbell's or whatever it is. You have a brand name that people trust. But you can only do that when you're at the height of your career. So he says what people actually falter is they don't do that. And then when people they wait too long, people stop caring about them. And then now you have a brand and people are like, oh, okay, he's just trying to make money because he's already kind of on the outs in the music industry. And he said, you can't do that. Yeah.
No, it's a great example. And I hope we can all kind of learn from that, because that's how our lives and careers work over time.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very interesting because, and I imagine like in the context of could be let's say in the context of a podcast, let's say somebody just started a brand new podcast. So we've been at it what, close to 3 years now?
No, over 3. We're
Over
almost
3.
at 4.
I
We're
forgot.
Well
almost
done.
at 4. Yeah, thank you.
So, but imagine, a podcast just began, right? And let's say they have their marketing on point. Let's say they studied Dan Kennedy, Seth Godin, whatever, other figures, and they know how to do sales copywriting, and they know that algorithm, SEO, they know how to, let's say, organize all these different structures in order to get the most views. They know how to do clickbait marketing, all of that. Fantastic. But they just began, right? And let's say they did all of this at the very beginning, and the quality, so let's say they do get millions of people watching their stuff somehow, right? But the quality of what it is that they're offering might not match the amount of viewers that you're actually able to get, right? And so I imagine that probably if you try to implement changes too fast, right, even though on the surface they seem like they're really beneficial, it could actually be detrimental in the long run, because then maybe, let's say you do have that, but then you don't have the skill, then you could lose all those people, and it doesn't really matter that your marketing is fantastic, or you might have to shift lanes at that point. But at the same time, also, conversely, if you wait too long, or not wait too long, rather, if you don't actually implement new changes and sort of observe what it is that what are the effects of them, then also that could be to your detriment, right? Like you get caught
I think
in
we're
that.
back on the tightrope.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's about not I completely agree, right? I mean, the point of the tightrope is if you did swing too far, right, you made too big of jumps too fast, you're going to fall off.
Right.
But in the height of a podcast, when things are really going well, what a beautiful time to experiment. You will have much more forgiveness, right?
Yeah.
As you try to learn what could work. But it doesn't mean a mass scale experiment, right? It could be smaller pieces. But I do think that goes back to the tightrope. It's try it, see, right? A lot of experiment, reflect, try, gather feedback, try again. And by doing it when you're actually in your strength, you're absolutely going to have much more possibilities for the future and what might be version 2.0, because you're basically building 2.0 while 1.0 is in its peak.
Yes.
Yeah. So experimenting, just probably you would recommend maybe experimenting bit by bit, not
Bit
too
by
many
bit.
changes. Yeah. While retaining the old, what makes the old,
Yeah,
what it is.
What's really been great for us is like when we're thinking about shared values and sort of what matters and what we want this podcast to look like. So since our focus is heavily, it's not the only thing, but it's the main thing. So it's heavily philosophical, heavily related to psychology, mental health, kind of inner tools that we could sort of help people cultivate. So we shifted from mental health experts to, let's say, athletes like football players, pro wrestlers. And, some of the thinking was like, okay, how are we going to fit this into what we do? And so, even somebody would ask me, they're like, wait, how are you have like a philosopher on one day and then a pro wrestler on the other? Well, this is right. And it's sort of funny, right? Like, how does that work? Well, here's how it works, because a lot of what we talk about is, first of all, pro wrestlers are successful people, just like, athletes are successful people, philosophers, psychologists, whatever. So the thing is, they have struggles and setbacks just like other people do. So when we're thinking about coping and sort of resilience and then cultivating these mental tools, they're actually just as big of a help as people who are like, experts in the field who do research in it. So we had the wrestler Diamond Dallas Page on, and he had this really great quote, which I feel like it could just be put on a wall somewhere. And he said, look, never underestimate the power that other people give you by believing in you, but also never underestimate the power that you give to yourself by believing in you too. And I love that, right? And so again, and you think about, how these two worlds fit, and I'm like, actually, they're a perfect fit. Because if you're thinking about the underlying values, and I would say our mission statement here, if there is one, it's to essentially help people become more resilient, to help them deal with setbacks better, to help them even cultivate tools again to believe in themselves. You can find that in so many different places, just because it seems like different worlds. Like, yes, obviously DDP is not an academic, but a lot of what he does, especially with his yoga practice, it helps people feel better about themselves.
What I love about what you guys are doing in that regard is, then you become a bridge between theory and practice.
Yes.
You could decide at some point you split those podcasts or one replaces, but for at least now, it sounds like you've got a really beautiful synergy working between different types of individuals with a higher level mission that's the connector.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. I love that.
So well done.
Thank you. And then, so just final question before we go, because I felt like this was also another really important part of your book. So, a lot of what we focus on is what we can do and sort of tools and, kind of cultivating a different mindset. But then there's this other part of your book about serendipity and the role that luck plays in all of this, right? So can we talk a little bit about that? And this is going to be the final endpoint to our conversation. But can we talk about how it's not just what you do, but it's also sort of the opportunities that life presents to you, and essentially not necessarily cultivating them, but sort of putting yourself in the place to at least for them to present themselves to you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, serendipity is a different version of improvisation in that it's but also very paradoxical, because I think serendipity means planned luck. I mean, the simplest way I sometimes say this to my students is I think about, it's about how do you sharpen your peripheral vision so that you can make connections that take you to the next place, right? Being in the right place at the right time is more than luck, right? It's about putting yourself there. So it could be, I've decided I'm going to get a new car. And the next thing you know, I'm talking to everybody about, what do you have? What do you have? What do you like? And then I start to, get a little more focused on, I think it's, this particular model and this particular year. And suddenly I see them all over. Right? It's like you've heightened your senses with what's going on because you've said, I'm looking. Yeah. Right? And I think that's where serendipity gets really powerful when it comes to innovation and learning, because you've basically said, I know what I'm looking for. I'm going to keep exploring. I want to build people's resilience and capabilities. And you start to see new people and think, boy, wouldn't they be great to be on the show? Right? You have a conversation and think, boy, that connects with what so-and-so said. But it's because you've actually put yourself out there with this higher view. Serves in some ways as this boundary for pulling people together, and you start taking risks. I can imagine you guys do it all the time, but I'm talking oftentimes to, undergraduate students saying, this is the time to take risks. And I'm not saying being crazy or dangerous, because then you say, but let's think about what you really want to get to. Why would you do a study abroad? Why would you take a particular co-op? I mean, these sound like basic stories, but to an 18, 19, 20-year-old, it's a big decision. And how do you do it in a way? I'm not just, it's like being a tourist versus really doing something like study abroad. Are you letting it wash over you? Or you actually have your eyes wide open and you're looking for learning and possibilities and next opportunities. Now you've opened the door to serendipity. And that's where I think it gets really exciting for all of us.
Right. I love that. And you also have a great personal story about how you became a dean. So this will be the last thing. Can you share that with us? Because that's a perfect example of serendipity.
I love it that you pulled that one out. I think about that one often. So on my own personal S-curve, I realized I was starting to lose my mojo. So I did a Fulbright in London, thinking that during this Fulbright that, well, maybe I'm going to stop being in administration and go back to research. So I'm giving my research everywhere. I mean, any place that would have me, all the major business schools. And I had this amazing day at Cass Business School, which is where I ended up becoming dean, sharing my research. I mean, I hit it off with everybody. I just loved it. But my last meeting, and maybe I won't say the business school actually, was at another business school. I can't remember if I said it in the book. And
you did.
Did I say it in the book? Okay, so it was the London Business School, which is a fantastic school, just a fantastic, and I really appreciate the people, but it was the worst presentation of my life because I was clearly in a room of economists and finance people who talking about paradox and philosophy was not hitting the mark. And so for about an hour and a half, I was just trying to take calm breaths. I was trying to work through it. It was so bad. By the time I left, I walked the hour and a half home instead of getting on the tube. About a year later, I'm sitting in my office at Cass in London, now a dean, having tea, which I had a lot of in London, with the senior professor who was on the search firm. And I said to him, boy, I am so grateful for all the opportunities I took during that Fulbright. I mean, especially my visit to Cass. And he said, that's not why you're here. And I said, what do you mean? He said, I was in the audience at LBS. I said, that was awful. That day was crazy. And he said, oh no, Marianne, you missed the point. I walked out of that and I called the president of our university and I said, I think I might have just met our new next dean. Anybody who can take that barrage of tough questions for that long from outstanding faculty and keep smiling and be poised could be the dean. And I walked away thinking, you don't know. You don't know where your opportunities are. All you can do is put yourself out there for them to happen. And then the connections get made. I'm sure the cast visit mattered too, but who would have known that would have happened? But it took some risks. And I'm glad I did it. And I will always remember that and help myself be more courageous in taking bigger risks.
I love
Wow.
that. Such an excellent story. All right, Alan, final questions for Marianne before we wrap up?
Oh, yes. So if you wanted to follow your work, and of course, buy the book, where can we do that?
Thank you. I'm on all of the major channels, or we've got bothandthinking.net is a website that Wendy and I have started that we collect podcast links and others so you can read what we've been doing. And we also just want to make sure that we're amplifying work of podcasts such as both of yours. I mean, I think this is a wonderful opportunity, again, to connect the dots between so many people, one, doing really interesting work to help people think differently, be more resilient, be more connected, but also, to your point, to study and learn from leaders and experts who are living it in their daily lives. So I appreciate this opportunity. Alan, Leon, it really has been a pleasure.
Absolutely. Wait, and Marianne, so social media links.
My social media links are on, and now you're going to question me. My other screen just went off. I'm on LinkedIn and Instagram, Marianne W. Lewis. Find me there.
And you're also on Twitter, right?
I am on Twitter as well. Thank you.
All right. Absolutely, Marianne.
Awesome.
Thank you so much for coming on. This was epic.
Oh, my appreciation. All the best to both of you. Thank you.
All right. Talk to you soon.
Okay. Might be one of my favorite episodes in a while.
I told you.
And you know what? That's kind of increasingly been the thing I say.
I know.
But I don't know.
Did I call it? I told you.
Good. Yeah.
I told you.
Well, anyway, if you want to follow us, you can follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook, Instagram, and on Twitter, where it's Seize_podcast. Like, subscribe,
hit the bell on YouTube.
And thank you again so much for watching, and see you next time.